Education around lifting weights is a bottomless pit of misinformation. And to describe the fitness information space as one which contains education, in quotations, is to really insult the meaning of the word. It's more like the fitness opinions space, or perhaps the fitness opinions formed by emotional whims and subjective experience space. So, what's produced within this space, you might ask? Well, far more often than not, videos and posts which contain an effectively limitless quantity of baseless claims about exercise that any middle school physics class could readily debunk. And what's more concerning to me, at least, is the unwavering confidence in such claims that fitness influencers exude as they make them. Most influencers are perfectly content to ramble on day in and day out, uninterrupted by the fire hose that is their own bullshit. Now, don't get me wrong, bullshit is quite powerful. It's convincing. After all, bullshitters are able to display a very specific kind of confidence that non-bullshitters aren't, because bullshitters are often unaware of their own ignorance, which ultimately allows them to capture the attention of millions of well-intentioned but unknowing viewers, which is likely the majority of them. This is an actual problem, because the advice that one takes about exercise can directly determine their experience of exercise, not only in terms of specific application of information, like how to perform a triceps pushdown, but also in terms of the frameworks and narratives that one forms around exercise and around their bodies as a whole. For instance, I receive daily messages about tried and true exercises, like leg extensions, which have been performed by bodybuilders for decades, literally decades, with immense success, claiming that they're a waste of time, or at minimum, not worth doing. I also know people who are so deeply captured by the teachings of specific fitness cults or influencers that they genuinely believe a subtle visual asymmetry between their shoulders is as serious a condition as the literal tearing of a muscle. And I'm not making that up. So how did we get here? And what can we do as people who deeply care about this information to be the change we seek to make? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to understand what's actually happening. And the way I view it, there are really two kinds of misinformation peddlers. There are those who claim to be science-based, in quotations, and there are those who claim authority by implication of their physical appearance. So let's talk about the latter first, something I like to call the physique-based influencer. Now, social media took off as a prominent form of information dissemination in the mid-2000s. And for a while, it appeared that most creators had a genuine love for the art of lifting. And content was essentially created for the sake of sharing experience, rather than purely for revenue generation, as it seems is often the case now. By 2016, the TikTokification of everything rapidly drained the popularity of real education and fitness, and with it came an influx of content creators who seized the opportunity to make a living by making 30 to 60 second promiscuous videos about exercise. Now, it's almost 2025, and anyone with a smartphone and an opinion or an emotional whim can become an overnight success, in quotations, as a fitness educator, also in quotations. Social media is obviously not without its upsides. I've personally been fortunate enough to make a living by sharing information I've learned over the years, and have felt and continue to feel incredibly lucky in doing so. And whether or not you view your reading or listening to this as a positive or negative is, of course, up to you. Although all domains of the information space globally have followed this same trend, there is something especially problematic about the fitness space that seems unlike any other industry. Anyone with a genetically or pharmacologically gifted physique is seen as an automatic expert. As long as someone looks the part, to the average consumer, they're not only trustworthy, but probably more worth listening to than the true expert who not only has decades of real education, but decades of actual experience working with real people. And while there is absolutely something to be said about the potential hard work and dedication required to achieve such a physique, the lack of barrier to entry here is an overwhelming downside to the space. We even see this in personal training spaces where a personal trainer can effectively gain a certification over the course of a weekend and the following week be ready to train people without any kind of real education. And something that's especially clear to me about the social media space and the physique-based influencer is that young people are disproportionately burdened by this situation. Not only do young people not yet have the education or maturity to inform their decision making with any degree of real scrutiny, but they're also in a cognitively fragile time period, which ultimately leaves them subject to the kind of emotional manipulation that most adults just aren't subject to. Now, speaking from experience, when I was younger, all I saw were men and women who were shredded to the gills with muscle, right? If only I could have bought their programs, perhaps I could have achieved the results that these influencers had, or so I thought. And during that time period, I developed what I now understand as a specific kind of body dysmorphia, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically a mental condition, informally diagnosed in my case, obviously, as I'm not a medical professional, that is characterized by an obsessive focus on perceived flaws or defects in one's physical appearance. And it's only really been in recent years that I've come to a place where I can genuinely say that I'm comfortable and confident in my own skin. I'm sure many of you who are listening have had similar experiences. And I raise this point not as a plea for sympathy, but rather just as one of many examples of how unknowing younger people may be affected by the structure, or really lack thereof, of the current fitness information landscape. Now, in essence, if you're born a genetically gifted person, or you take steroids, or more likely both, you're immediately seen as someone worth listening to. And this is a problem. While I'm not confident that this issue will ever be fully eradicated, the more awareness we bring to the subject, the more we can shape expectations and form worldviews that are of a sound mind. Now, moving on to the sort of second kind of fitness misinformation influencer type, we have what I will call the science-based influencer. Now, science-based here is put in quotations for reasons we'll discuss, but in my estimation, the science-based influencer was actually originally formed, or at least meant to be formed, as a sort of reaction to the first kind of influencer, where bringing science into fitness at first seemed like a really good thing. Now, much like the former category of influencer, it has many of its own issues that are actually distinct. And so while the science-based influencer originally served as a kind of solution to the first kind of influencer that we talked about, it's now sort of become its own problem for, again, very different reasons. And so these are individuals, in essence, who claim explicitly or implicitly through their content that they are, in quotations, science-based. Now, of course, this is not mutually exclusive from the first kind of misinformation influencer, although it often is for understandable reasons. Much like myself, many people become interested in how they can optimize their training for the best results, specifically because they did not win the genetic lottery. The genetic door is often closed to the average person, as is the pharmacological door for personal reasons. So other doors are opened through time and through effort. And seeing through the false presentation of the science-based influencer is perhaps even more difficult for the average person, as I discussed earlier, in part due to the use of jargon on the part of the influencer, and in part due to the lack of understanding of the scientific worldview on the part of the viewer, and also oftentimes on the part of the influencer. So, more often than not, science-based influencers are those who tend to blend just enough knowledge with pseudoscience to sound credible, but who ultimately end up misleading more than they inform. These individuals often use vague, nebulous terms like tightness, weakness, and instability to justify claims that do little to improve anyone's strength or musculature. Instead, they often create confusion, prolong problems, and divert attention away from the simple, effective principles that underpin genuine progress in the gym. Now, at the heart of the science-based rhetoric in fitness is generally two things. Number one, use of terms that seem meaningful but crumble under any degree of real scrutiny. And number two, apparently appropriate references to real research made with little to no understanding of what the scientific worldview actually is, which is a model ultimately rooted in skepticism and uncertainty, not the kind of ignorant confidence that most influencers speak with. In the same way that references to the research are often made with no contextualization, words like tightness are often thrown around without context or clarity. And so it's all ultimately an issue of lacking the necessary understanding and also the specificity and clarity that would be necessary to communicate such an understanding. For instance, if you say someone is tight or that your problems are due to tightness, is the tightness structural? Is it neural? Is it simply perceptual? Are the cited studies that one uses even relevant to a particular context? Were the cited studies actually read and understood by such influencers? Now, in my estimation, few influencers bother to specify anything because doing so would reveal the limits of their understanding. And at this point, rather than to go down the research rabbit hole and all of its associated problems, which I've done a number of times before on this podcast, I'll focus now specifically on the use of jargon, just because it's a little bit easier to give examples for, and how the alleged science-based influencer weaponizes such words. So, take the words weakness and instability, for example. These words are often wielded by the science-based influencer to diagnose dysfunction in a way that sounds authoritative but rarely actually addresses any root of any issue. These words are conveniently vague, right? They invite confidence rather than skepticism or uncertainty. And this often leaves the audience reliant on the influencer, luckily for the influencer, who's supposedly someone who has all the solutions. So, for example, an influencer might claim that your squats suck because your core is weak, right? Or your glutes, they're just not firing. These statements, they lack actionable specificity. What precisely is weak? And compared to what? How does this purported weakness translate to a lifter's inability to squat properly, right? All these kinds of terms, statements, pieces of content, they're 10 miles wide and a centimeter deep. Right? Such language obscures what the real issue could be. The lifter may simply need cues that are more appropriate for them. They may simply need to adjust their setup or just use a different overall program that is more tailored to their current capabilities. And so many of these science-based influencers, they thrive on partial truths. Right? They may point out that the body is indeed complex, right? That movement involves the interplay between joints and muscles and the nervous system. They may even use phrases like motor unit recruitment, They may even provide a link to a PubMed study that you'd never seen before. But they often capitalize on an audience's lack of understanding to overcomplicate problems and to sell interventions. So it's common to hear such influencers invoke concepts like muscle imbalances or asymmetries, as though every lifter or normal person must achieve biomechanical perfection before they can safely train. And so I give all these examples to basically describe what the framing that these influencers are creating is. Right? All of this framing feeds into a broader narrative of what a science-based mind undoubtedly is not. Right? It is not something that provides straightforward, confident explanations and predictions. And so by convincing recreational lifters that science is this straightforward thing, that study A can make conclusion A and there's nothing to be said about it, the facts are the facts, perhaps that, your body is fragile or it's riddled with deficits or incapable of safe movement without intervention. These influencers, they're not only perpetuating misunderstanding and misinformation, but also a certain kind of fear that doesn't exist in other spaces. So the average person who's consuming science-based content may become hyper-focused on chasing elusive fixes, in quotations, rather than improving technique based on the goal, building strength, and just progressively loading normal movements over time. So in reality, the vast majority of these perceived issues that the science-based influencer may propose can be resolved not by obscure corrective exercises or pseudoscientific theories, but by simply training, and by simply training to match one's anatomy and one's capabilities and tolerances, right? All of this complexity makes the influencer's advice appear sophisticated, but it frequently leads to a certain kind of paralysis by analysis that, based on my personal experience, is only becoming more popular. And so many of the solutions to these supposed problems are deceptively simple, right? Do you have trouble squatting? Perhaps just adjust your foot position, or the bar placement, or the tempo, or the implement one is using. You have trouble feeling a muscle work? Experiment with the angles you're using, or the ranges of motion, or the resistance profile, or the load selection. Do you have tightness in a muscle? Well, it might not require the endless amounts of stretching that so-called influencers recommend, but instead just more appropriate loading and different ranges of motions within the exercises that you're doing. So lifting is ultimately an art and science at its core, but it really is astonishingly simple. And the body adapts to overload, right? Load a muscle with enough resistance, do so through a range of motion that's appropriate for you, and allow time for recovery. So I give all these different kinds of examples because they all point to something very, very similar, which is just simply this. True lifting education is immensely difficult to come across. But at bottom, whether we're talking about the physique-based influencer or the science-based influencer, we're talking about lifting weights, right? And more specifically, we're talking about the interaction of our anatomy with lifting weights. And so what that means is that all education around lifting is ultimately rooted in the study of basic physics, right? Just think about it. How could someone possibly understand the world of exercise without a rudimentary understanding of force? After all, exercise, again, is merely the interaction of force and our bodies. So without an understanding of force, by definition, exercise is completely unintelligible. Right? The same goes for education of anatomy. The human body must abide by the same laws of physics as every other object on Earth, whether sentient or not. So if the education you're consuming pays no respect to the physics of things, should you really consider it education? If the education you're consuming is chock full of vague descriptions about what muscles are trained in what scenarios, what muscles are tight or weak with no reference to the underlying anatomy and the interaction of anatomy with the external world, should you really consider it education? If the education you're consuming justifies itself on the basis of a single study or a couple of studies, should you really consider it education? Now, I'm not here to argue that 100% of every lifting video, email, or post need be inundated with conversations about moment arms and torque and inertia. But if the creators that you're following at large never even think to make mention of such things, that is a problem. And if there are certain channels or influencers you follow who claim to be science based, but who at heart are really entertainers, there's nothing wrong with being an entertainer, but there is something wrong with being an entertainer and claiming to be something else. So I came up with a potential checklist for you all to kind of end this on somewhat of a practical note, a little bit of a series of questions that one might ask themselves about the content creators that they follow. Right, so here goes. Number one, can the content creator that you follow explain complex topics in a clear, simple, and digestible way, in a way that avoids the use of large amounts of jargon and overgeneralized terminology? Right? True understanding means being able to break down complicated concepts into language that anyone can grasp. Number two, do they handle unexpected or nuanced questions thoughtfully and accurately? A knowledgeable person can essentially adapt and explain concepts beyond their prepared content. And if you never see these people on things like podcasts, that may be a red flag. Number three, does the content creator that you follow go beyond surface level explanations to explore deeper principles, context, and real world applications ever? Right? Extremely superficial content probably suggests limited understanding, while depth reflects some kind of expertise. Number four, do they reference research without describing what the research actually assessed? Copy pasting links to studies and taking screenshots and putting them on videos does not make one scientific. Communicating with caveats and a clear understanding of what the scientific worldview is does. Number five, can they use relevant analogies, metaphors, or examples to explain complex ideas? Creators with a solid grasp can generally make concepts relatable through simple but creative teaching methods. Number six, and this is probably one of the most important in my opinion, do content creators admit when they don't know something or when the answer depends on context? And can they specifically define that context once they say that it depends? Right? Confidence paired with honesty and actual integrity shows a level of understanding and trustworthiness that I think is extremely important, especially in today's day and age. And finally, can the content creator you follow demonstrate how their teachings actually apply to practical scenarios, right? Or are they just sort of pontificating about things that sound good, but that do little to inform actual practice? So overall, the antidote to charlatanism, which is what this all ultimately is in fitness, is a certain kind of clarity and honesty on the part of the influencer and a healthy skepticism on the part of the audience. And as a message to all of you who are still listening, I think that skepticism is one of the most important things in creating and maintaining a healthy information space. We must try to all collectively resist the allure of things like vague diagnoses, right? Like I mentioned, tightness and weakness and dysfunction, or references to non-contextualized research, right? As well as overcomplicated solutions. If someone says, hey, this is why I think this, and their reasoning is a link to a study or the last sentence of an abstract of a study, you should ask that person, what do you mean? What are you trying to say? Right? Can you explain yourself? Or are you comfortable simply just hiding behind the text that someone else has written out of context? So instead of all this, we need to try to prioritize principles over gimmicks, education over dependence on others, and simplicity over obfuscation. We need to make things more clear and more obvious to especially the average person who's just sort of starting to learn about this whole lifting thing. True expertise lies not in making things seem harder than they are, more complicated than they are, but in helping others pave a path forward with specificity and with openness. And so, as an educator myself, I think that the task of any educator is basically to demystify the process, right? Not to invent the dysfunction where none exist, or to mysteriously make reference to claims using the phrase, the research says, in every piece of content, but rather to empower people, right? To empower lifters to train hard, but to train responsibly with some kind of principled guidance. Again, rooted in the physics of things. And so, in the end, lifting and the fitness information space is not really about finding perfection or even optimization, right? It is fundamentally about progress and making progress. And progress, as it turns out, is a surprisingly simple affair. And so my goals in educating others moving forward is to not fall into the kind of influencer traps that are so common to fall into now. And I hope to make more content, more podcasts, more emails, more posts in the community to be able to not just show you what I know, but to be able to actually help you in doing so. And I think that ultimately, as long as I can demonstrate that and do my best to lead the way, that others can start to recognize what honesty and real education in this space is. And I hope that overall, this podcast lecture thing that I just did served as a helpful reminder to many of the problems that currently exist in the fitness information space. And while the solution may, in some sense, be boundlessly complex to a problem like this, at bottom, this issue really starts with you, the listener, and who you spend more time listening to or less time listening to, and who you give more of your attention today and tomorrow and every day to come. So again, I hope to be a sort of beacon of light where I can, and thank you all for listening. I'll try to do more of these longer sort of monologue style podcasts if you all enjoy them. And please feel free to leave a comment on whatever platform you happen to be listening on.